The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Peterson's front porch as he slowly rocked in his wooden chair, his weathered hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran had seen more of life than most, but these quiet mornings at his Montana home were what he treasured most. Frank lived in a modest house along Highway 12, where the road curved gently around the mountains. His property wasn't large, but it included something special: Peterson's Place, a small diner he'd opened in 1946 after returning home from the war. The diner sat right next to his house, its red and white striped awning now faded from years under the Montana sun. Every morning, without fail, Frank followed the same routine he'd kept for decades. He would wake up at 5:30 a.m., put on his navy blue cardigan, no matter the weather, and shuffle to his small kitchen to make his first cup of coffee. His movements were slower now, but his mind remained sharp as ever. Today was Thursday, one of the 3 days he still opened the diner. Frank couldn't manage full-time operations anymore, but he refused to close completely. A man needs purpose, he often said to anyone who suggested he fully retire. As he finished his coffee, Frank noticed Mrs. Thompson's red pickup truck pulling into the diner's parking lot. She was always his first customer, just as she had been for the past 30 years. The old veteran smiled, grabbed his keys, and made his way to the diner's side door. "Morning, Frank," Mrs. Thompson called out, her gray hair neatly pinned back. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Every day above ground is a beautiful day, Sarah," Frank replied with a warm smile, using his regular joke that never failed to make her chuckle. Inside the diner, everything had a story. The counter's worn spots marked where thousands of cups of coffee had been served. The booth cushions, though reupholstered several times, still held their original springs from 1946. But the most special feature was the Wall of Heroes, a collection of black and white photographs covering the entire back wall. Frank switched on the lights, and the faces of local veterans seemed to come alive. Each photograph told a story of sacrifice, of young men and women who had served their country. Some, like Frank, had returned home. Others hadn't been so fortunate. In the center of the wall hung a photo of James Peterson, Frank's younger brother, forever frozen at age 19 in his crisp military uniform. As Frank started the coffee maker, more regulars began arriving. There was Tom, the local mailman who always ordered 2 eggs over easy with extra toast. Behind him came the Johnson twins, now in their 70s, who'd been coming in since they were teenagers. Each customer got a personal greeting, and often a story they heard a dozen times before, but no one minded. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the silver hair of the old veteran as he moved between tables. Despite his age, Frank insisted on serving customers himself. He might be slower than he once was, but his hands remained steady enough to carry plates and pour coffee. By mid-morning, the usual breakfast crowd had thinned out. Frank took this quiet moment to do what he always did. He walked to the Wall of Heroes and straightened each picture frame, even though they were already perfectly aligned. His fingers lingered on his brother's photograph. "Still keeping everything shipshape, eh, Mr. Peterson?" asked Jenny, a young waitress who helped out on busy days. She was the granddaughter of one of Frank's old war buddies, and he'd given her a job when she needed one most. "A tidy ship is a happy ship," Frank replied, quoting his old Navy commander. "And please, Jenny, I told you 100 times, it's just Frank." As the lunch hour approached, Frank began preparing for the next wave of customers. He might be 93, but he ran his diner with the same precision and care he'd learned in the military. Every table was properly set, every condiment bottle full, and every coffee cup ready for refilling. What Frank didn't know, as he went about his familiar routine that Thursday morning, was that his peaceful world was about to change. The rumble of motorcycles in the distance was about to bring unexpected trouble to his quiet corner of Montana. But for now, he was simply Frank Peterson, the 93-year-old veteran who made the best apple pie in 3 counties and never forgot a customer's name or their usual order. The first time the Road Raiders motorcycle gang rolled into Peterson's Place, it seemed like any other busy afternoon. The rumble of their engines made the diner's windows shake slightly as 12 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. Frank Peterson watched from behind the counter as leather-clad figures dismounted their bikes. The gang's leader, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, walked in first. His leather vest was covered in patches, none of them friendly-looking. A skull with flames decorated his back, and underneath it read, "Road Raiders MC." The rest of his crew followed, their heavy boots thumping against the diner's linoleum floor. Mrs. Thompson, who had been enjoying her usual Thursday apple pie, clutched her purse closer. The Johnson twins stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Even Jenny, the young waitress, took a step back toward the kitchen. But Frank Peterson stood tall behind his counter. He faced worse in his life than a group of rough-looking bikers. "Welcome to Peterson's place," he said in his calm, steady voice. "What can I get for you folks today?" The leader removed his sunglasses, revealing cold gray eyes. "Coffee. Black. For everyone," he announced, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate obedience. As Frank began pouring coffee, he noticed some of the bikers spreading out through the diner. They were too organized for it to be random. Two positioned themselves near the door, another stood by the restroom entrance, while others occupied strategic spots around the dining room. Regular customers began leaving quietly, dropping money on their tables and hurrying out. Mrs. Thompson gave Frank a worried look as she left, but he just nodded reassuringly. He'd seen this kind of intimidation before, back in the war. These men might wear leather instead of uniforms, but their tactics were familiar. "Nice place you got here, old-timer," the leader said, running a finger along the counter's surface. "Been around a while, hasn't it?" There was something in his tone that made it sound more like a threat than a compliment. "Since 1946, Frank replied, continuing to pour coffee with steady hands. "Opened it right after I got back from the Pacific." One of the bikers laughed. "Hear that, Snake? The old man's a war hero." The mockery in his voice was clear. Snake, apparently the leader's name, smiled without warmth. As Frank served their coffee, he watched them through the corners of his eyes. They were sizing up the place, looking at the layout, the exits, the number of customers. Their coffee cups remained mostly untouched. Then one of them noticed the wall of heroes. "Hey, check this out," a younger biker called out. He walked over to the wall, his coffee forgotten. "Got yourself a little museum here, Pops." Frank felt his jaw tighten as the biker's dirty fingers pointed at various photographs. "Those are local veterans," he said firmly. "Men and women who served their country." Snake walked over to join his companion, studying the wall with exaggerated interest. "Quite a collection. Shame if anything happened to it." He turned to Frank with a cold smile. "Old photographs can be so fragile." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Frank's hands gripped the coffee pot tighter, but his voice remained steady. "The coffee's on the house today, gentlemen, but I think it's time for you to leave." Snake's smile widened. "Oh, we'll leave. For now." He pulled out a wallet and dropped a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change, old-timer. We'll be seeing you again real soon." The bikers left as suddenly as they had arrived, their engines roaring to life in the parking lot. As their noise faded into the distance, Jenny emerged from the kitchen, shaking. "Mr. Peterson, Frank, maybe we should call the police." Frank shook his head slowly, his eyes still on the door. "Not yet, Jenny. They haven't done anything illegal. Yet." He walked over to the wall of heroes, straightening a frame that one of the bikers had purposely tilted. Looking at his brother's photograph, Frank felt a familiar determination rising in his chest. He'd fought bullies before, in places far worse than Montana. These road raiders might think they'd found an easy target in a 93-year-old veteran, but Frank Peterson had learned long ago that true strength wasn't always obvious. As he cleaned up the half-empty coffee cups, Frank began planning. The road raiders would be back, he was sure of that. And when they returned, they'd learn that some old soldiers never stopped being warriors. For the next 2 weeks, the road raiders made Peterson's place their unwanted afternoon hangout. They came in groups of 6 or 7, taking up the largest booths, playing loud music from their phones, and making other customers uncomfortable. Frank watched as his regular customers started disappearing one by one. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Frank sat at his kitchen table, writing in a small black notebook. Jenny peeked over his shoulder as she brought him a cup of tea. "What are you doing, Frank?" she asked, noticing his neat handwriting filling page after page. "Something I learned in the war," Frank replied, not looking up from his writing. "Document everything. Times, dates, names if you have them. Build a case." His pen moved steadily across the paper as he recorded another incident. What Jenny didn't know was that Frank Peterson wasn't just any veteran. Back in 1943, he had been selected for a special military unit that dealt with complex situations behind enemy lines. They weren't just soldiers. They were problem solvers who used their brains as much as their weapons. Frank opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside was a collection of medals he rarely showed anyone. His fingers touched a particularly distinctive one, the Office of Strategic Services badge, marking him as one of the predecessors to modern special forces. "Jenny," Frank said quietly, "would you mind watching the diner for an hour? I need to make a phone call." In his study, Frank picked up his landline phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Captain Mike Reynolds speaking." "Mike, it's Frank Peterson." There was a moment of silence, then warm recognition. "Frank? Frank from Montana. Lord Almighty, it's been what, 15 years?" "Too long, Mike. Listen, I need some advice about handling the situation." Frank explained about the road raiders, their intimidation tactics, and their threats. Mike listened carefully, then chuckled. "Frank, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? The old playbook?" "Page 47, Frank confirmed. Psychological countermeasures against hostile forces." "The bikers won't know what hit them," Mike said. "Give me 48 hours. I'll make some calls." That afternoon, the road raiders showed up again. This time, Snake, their leader, walked straight to the counter where Frank was polishing coffee cups. "Business seems slow, old-timer," Snake smirked, looking around the nearly empty diner. "Might be time to consider selling. I know some people who might be interested." Frank continued polishing his cup. "Interesting suggestion," he said calmly. "But I learned something important in the war about negotiations." Snake laughed. "Oh yeah, what's that?" "Never make decisions under pressure." Frank set down his cup and looked directly into Snake's eyes. "And never underestimate your opponent." Something in Frank's steady gaze made Snake's smile fade slightly. For the first time, he noticed how the old man stood, balanced, ready, like someone who knew how to handle himself. Later that night, after closing up, Frank made 3 more phone calls. The first was to his old friend at the local newspaper. The second was to the State Veterans Affairs Office. The third was to someone he hadn't spoken to in decades, his former commanding officer's son, now a prominent social media consultant. In his black notebook, Frank began a new page. At the top, he wrote Operation Restoration, the same way he used to label mission plans in 1944. Below it, he listed 5 phases, each carefully thought out. "First rule of strategic operations," he muttered to himself, remembering his old training, "control the narrative." The next morning, Frank got to work early. He began putting up new photographs on the wall of heroes, not just of World War II veterans, but also from Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and more recent conflicts. Each photo told a story of service and sacrifice. As he worked, Frank thought about what his old commander used to say: "The strongest weapon in your arsenal is the one between your ears." These bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they were about to learn a lesson about different kinds of strength. Frank heard motorcycles approaching in the distance, but this time, instead of feeling worried, he smiled. Phase 1 of Operation Restoration was about to begin, and Frank Peterson hadn't lost a battle yet. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Frank was serving coffee to the few loyal customers who still came to his diner when the road raiders roared into the parking lot. This time, there were more of them than usual, at least 20 bikes. Snake entered first, followed by his crew. Something was different today. Their usual smirks were gone, replaced by angry expressions. Frank noticed they'd been drinking. You could smell the alcohol as they pushed through the door. "Everyone out." Snake shouted to the customers. Diners closed. Mrs. Thompson clutched her chest in fear. The Johnson twins helped her up, guiding her toward the door. Jenny started to move toward the kitchen, but Frank gave her a subtle hand signal to stay where she was. He taught her that signal last week. It meant watch and record. "Quite a show of force today," Frank said calmly, standing behind his counter. "Something bothering you boys?" Snake slammed his fist on the counter. "You been causing trouble, old man, making phone calls, talking to newspapers. Our business partners aren't happy." Frank noticed Jenny quietly holding her phone, recording everything, just as he'd asked her to do if things got rough. Good girl. Freedom of speech, Frank replied, still one of the rights we fought for. Your war stories don't mean nothing here. One of the younger bikers, clearly drunk, stumbled toward the wall of heroes. Let's see how tough you are now, old-timer. Before Frank could move, the biker grabbed a framed photograph and smashed it against the wall. Glass shattered across the floor. It was the photo of James Peterson, Frank's brother who never came home from Guadalcanal. The diner fell silent. Even some of the raiders looked uncomfortable. They might be troublemakers, but destroying a fallen soldier's memorial was crossing a line. Frank stood very still, his eyes fixed on his brother's broken photograph. For a moment, he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back in 1943, promising his mother he'd look after James, promising to keep his memory alive. That's enough, Frank said quietly. His voice had changed. Gone was the friendly diner owner. This was the voice of Command Sergeant Peterson, the man who'd led special operations behind enemy lines. What you gonna do about it, Grandpa? Snake laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. Something in Frank's stance had changed. Frank walked slowly around the counter. Despite his age, he moved with purpose. You boys think you know something about power, he said. About intimidation, but you're just playground bullies with loud motorcycles. Watch your mouth, old man. Snake stepped forward threateningly. Frank didn't flinch. I faced down real enemies. Men who believed in something, even if it was wrong. But you? He looked around at the gang. You're nothing but cowards picking on old folks and breaking pictures of dead heroes. Some of the younger raiders looked away, ashamed. Frank pressed on, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command. That young man in the photo you just broke? He died saving his entire platoon. Threw himself on a grenade. He was 19 years old. Frank's eyes were steel. He died so people like you could have the freedom to be exactly what you are, even if what you are is a disgrace to everything he died for. Snake's face turned red with rage. He reached for Frank's shirt collar. Why you? Suddenly, multiple police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Jenny had pressed the silent alarm Frank had installed last week. Snake froze, his hand inches from Frank's chest. Those would be the state police, Frank said calmly. And unlike our local boys, they're not afraid of motorcycle gangs, especially ones caught on video vandalizing veterans' memorials. Jenny held up her phone, still recording. Some raiders were already rushing for the door. This isn't over, old man, Snake growled, backing away. No, Frank agreed, looking at his brother's broken photograph. It isn't over, but it is about to change. As the raiders scrambled to their bikes, Frank carefully picked up his brother's photo from the broken glass. The image was creased but intact. Looking at James's young face, Frank made a decision. Enough defense. It was time to take the fight to them, not with fists or weapons, but with the strategic mind that had made him a legend in his unit. The war hero in him had finally awakened. The morning after the Wall of Heroes was vandalized, Frank's diner was unusually busy, but not with customers. Local news reporters crowded around the counter as Jenny carefully served them coffee. The TV camera crew set up their equipment near the broken frame that once held James Peterson's photograph. Frank sat at his usual spot, looking exactly as he always did in his navy blue cardigan. But today he had company. Next to him sat Mike Reynolds, his old military buddy, now a retired colonel, who had driven 6 hours through the night to be there. You're sure about this, Frank? Mike asked quietly. Once we start, there's no going back. Frank nodded, touching the folder in front of him. Inside were dozens of photographs, not just of the raiders vandalizing his diner, but pictures taken over the past month by his customers. Parents pulling their children away from the diner as bikers harassed them. Elderly veterans too scared to come in for their morning coffee. All carefully documented, just as he'd been trained. Time to launch Operation Restoration, Frank said, using their old military language. You make those calls? Mike smiled. Every veteran motorcycle club within 500 miles knows what happened here. They're not happy about it, especially about James's photo. The TV reporter approached their table, cameraman in tow. Mr. Peterson, we're ready for your interview. Frank stood up slowly, straightened his cardigan, and walked to the Wall of Heroes. The broken frame was still there. He left it deliberately. The reporter positioned herself next to him. Rolling in 3, 2, 1. I'm standing here with Frank Peterson, a 93-year-old World War II veteran, the reporter began. Mr. Peterson, tell us what happened here yesterday. Frank looked directly into the camera. His voice was clear and strong. Yesterday, a group of individuals chose to dishonor not just my diner, but the memory of every serviceman and woman on this wall. He gestured to James's broken photograph, including my younger brother, who gave his life saving his fellow soldiers. The interview continued for 15 minutes. Frank didn't mention the weeks of harassment or the threats. Instead, he talked about community, about honor, and about his dream of turning Peterson's Place into a gathering spot for veterans and civilians alike. My brother didn't die for us to be divided, he said. He died so we could live together in peace. As the news crew packed up, Mike's phone buzzed. He showed the screen to Frank. The interview was already going viral on social media. Veterans groups across the country were sharing it, adding their own stories of community and sacrifice. By afternoon, the diner's parking lot was full of motorcycles, but not the road raiders. These bikes belonged to veterans, many wearing their service patches proudly. They came in small groups, ordered coffee, and listened to Frank's stories. Some brought photographs of their own family members who had served. Jenny watched in amazement as Frank worked the room like a skilled diplomat. He wasn't just serving coffee, he was building an army of supporters, one conversation at a time. Mr. Peterson, a young veteran, approached him. We heard the raiders might be planning something big for revenge. Frank smiled. I'm counting on it. In his office that evening, Frank opened his black notebook. Phase 1, getting public attention, was complete. Phase 2 was already in motion as veteran motorcycle clubs quietly spread the word about protecting Peterson's Place. He picked up his phone and dialed another number from his past. After 2 rings, a woman answered. Sarah Martinez speaking. Sarah, it's Frank Peterson. Remember that favor you owe me from '82? There was a chuckle on the other end. The CIA never forgets its debts, Frank, especially to OS veterans. What do you need? Frank looked at his notebook. Information. Everything you can find about the road raiders' business connections, their real names, their day jobs, things they wouldn't want public. Give me 24 hours, Sarah replied. As Frank hung up, he heard more motorcycles arriving outside. Through his window, he could see veterans setting up an informal guard rotation in his parking lot. Some brought camping chairs, others brought coffee thermoses. They didn't know it yet, but they were all part of Frank's plan. The rogue raiders thought they were fighting an old man, but they were about to face something much more powerful, a veteran who never forgot his training in psychological warfare. The real battle was just beginning. The transformation of Peterson's Place over the next week was remarkable. What began as a handful of veteran bikers had grown into something extraordinary. The parking lot looked like a military reunion, with motorcycles from every veteran's motorcycle club in the region. Frank watched from his usual spot behind the counter as Jenny rushed between tables, serving coffee to men and women wearing leather vests covered in military patches. There were Vietnam vets sharing stories with Iraq War veterans, retired Marines swapping tales with old Army Rangers, and even a few active-duty soldiers who'd driven hours to show their support. More coffee, Frank? Asked Tom Wilson, a former Navy SEAL who'd been coordinating the volunteer security teams. You look tired. Frank smiled, but his eyes were alert as ever. Got some interesting news from Sarah last night, he said quietly, referring to his CIA contact. Seems our friends the road raiders have some powerful people worried. The information Sarah had provided was explosive. The raiders weren't just troublemakers. They were part of a larger criminal organization trying to buy up properties along Highway 12 for money laundering. Frank's Diner, with its strategic location, was a key piece of their plan. Outside, more bikes rolled in. These weren't just any veterans. They were members of the Guardian Angels, one of the most respected veteran motorcycle clubs in America. Their president, a tall woman named Maria Gonzalez who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, walked straight to Frank. Sergeant Peterson, she said formally, the Angels are at your service. Behind her, 30 riders stood at attention, their military bearing evident despite their leather jackets. Frank nodded gratefully. Just in time, Major Gonzalez. Our friends should be arriving soon. He wasn't guessing. His old intelligence network had intercepted messages between the road raiders. They were planning something big for tonight, gathering every member they could find for a show of force. What they didn't know was that Frank had been counting on this exact response. By sunset, the scene around Peterson's place was impressive. Hundreds of veterans' bikes lined the highway in both directions. Local families brought food and drinks. Someone had set up a projector, showing Frank's old war photographs on the diner's wall. The mood was peaceful but vigilant. Inside, Frank held a quiet meeting with the veteran club leaders. "Remember," he said firmly, "no violence. No matter what they do, we stay peaceful. That's an order." "But what if they start something?" a younger vet asked. Frank's eyes twinkled. "They won't, because we have something they don't expect." He nodded to Jenny, who wheeled in a TV from the back room. The local news was running a special report. Federal investigation launched into Road Raiders' criminal enterprise. The report detailed everything Sarah had uncovered: the money laundering, the property schemes, the connections to organized crime. "Right now," Frank explained, "every law enforcement agency in 3 states is watching the raiders. If they so much as jaywalk tonight, they'll have FBI agents on their doorsteps tomorrow." A low rumble of motorcycles in the distance caught everyone's attention. The road raiders were coming, and from the sound of it, they brought an army of their own. Frank walked outside, standing on his porch. Behind him, hundreds of veterans stood quietly. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. On one side, the road raiders, loud and aggressive. On the other, veterans of America's wars, standing peaceful but resolute. Snake led his group into the parking lot, but his usual swagger was gone. His eyes widened as he saw not just the veterans, but the news vans with their cameras rolling, the families watching from lawn chairs, and Frank Peterson standing calmly in the middle of it all. The old veteran had turned their show of force into a community event, their attempted intimidation into a celebration of service and unity. And now, with their criminal activities exposed on national news, the raiders couldn't afford to make a single wrong move. Frank stepped forward, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet parking lot. "Evening, boys," he said pleasantly. "Came back to finish our conversation?" The tension in the air was electric. Everyone waited to see what would happen next, but Frank Peterson, veteran of World War II and master of psychological warfare, already knew how this battle would end. He had learned long ago that the strongest position wasn't always the most obvious one. Snake dismounted his motorcycle, his face a mix of anger and uncertainty. The road raiders' usual intimidating presence seemed to shrink in the face of hundreds of veterans and rolling news cameras. The FBI investigation news playing on the outdoor screens didn't help their confidence either. "Let's talk inside," Frank said calmly, gesturing toward his diner. "Just you and me, Snake, like civilized folks." Snake looked around at his gang, then at the wall of veterans watching silently. He knew he was trapped: cause trouble and face federal agents, or talk with the old man. "Fine," he growled. 5 minutes. Inside Peterson's place, Frank led Snake to a special booth, the one where his brother James used to sit before shipping out to war. The diner was empty except for Jenny, who stood ready at the counter, and Mike Reynolds, who sat quietly in the corner. "Coffee?" Frank offered, already pouring 2 cups. "Cut the friendly act, old man," Snake snapped. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Frank set down the coffee cups and slowly took his seat. "Actually, I do. Your real name is William Tucker. You grew up in Ohio. Your father was a Marine, killed in Vietnam when you were 5. Snake's face went pale. "How did you?" "You're not the only one with connections, William," Frank said softly. "The question is, why does a Marine's son end up terrorizing a veteran's diner?" The question hung in the air. Snake, William, stared into his coffee cup, his tough guy facade cracking slightly. "He left us," William finally said, his voice different now. "Mom couldn't cope. Ended up in foster care. Nobody cared about a dead Marine's kid." Frank nodded slowly, reaching into his cardigan pocket. He pulled out an old folded photograph. "This was your father," he said, placing it on the table. "Sergeant James Tucker. He served with my friend Mike over there. He died saving his entire unit." William's hands shook as he looked at the photograph he'd never seen before. his father in full Marine dress uniform, young and proud. Your father was a hero, Frank continued. And you've spent years angry at him for leaving, taking that anger out on places like this. Places that remind you of what you lost. Tears formed in William's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. Outside, they could hear the murmur of the crowd, waiting to see what would happen. I have a proposition for you, Frank said, pulling out a document from his other pocket. Instead of trying to destroy Peterson's place, help me transform it. He slid the paper across the table. It was a proposal to turn the diner into a veteran civilian community center with a special program for children of fallen service members. Your father's sacrifice meant something, Frank said, and so can yours. Help me create a place where kids like you were, children who lost parents to war, can find support and understanding. William read the proposal, his hands still trembling. Why would you trust me after everything we did? Because I made a promise in 1944, Frank replied, to never stop believing in redemption. I've seen too many young men waste their lives on anger. It's time to break that cycle. Outside, veterans and raiders alike watched through the windows as William Tucker, known to them as Snake, stood up slowly. They saw him extend his hand to Frank Peterson, saw the old veteran shake it firmly. When they emerged from the diner, William faced his gang. It's over, he announced. The raiders are done here. He turned to the veterans. We owe you an apology, especially for the Wall of Heroes. Frank stepped forward, addressing both groups. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding. Not just the wall, but something bigger. A place where veterans and civilians can come together, where children of fallen heroes can find family. The tension in the air transformed into something else, hope. Some raiders looked relieved, others confused, but none objected as William took off his Road Raiders vest. Maria Gonzalez, the Guardian Angels leader, stepped forward. The Angels will help with the renovation, she announced. Other veteran groups quickly joined in, offering support. As the crowd began to mingle, former enemies becoming potential allies, Frank watched from his porch. In his pocket, he touched his brother James's damaged photograph. We did it, little brother, he whispered. We found a way to keep fighting, not with fists or guns, but with forgiveness and purpose. The war hero had won his final battle not with force, but with understanding and compassion. 1 year had passed since the night the Road Raiders became allies instead of enemies. Peterson's place had transformed into something remarkable. The small diner had expanded, with a new wing dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. Frank Peterson, now 94, sat in his favorite spot behind the counter, watching the morning crowd. The scene before him would have been unimaginable a year ago. Former Road Raiders, their leather vests now bearing a new patch, Veterans' Pride, sat sharing breakfast with Guardian Angels members. William Tucker, once known as Snake, worked behind the counter alongside Jenny, helping serve the morning rush. More coffee, Frank? William asked, holding up the pot. His face had softened over the past year, the angry lines replaced by laugh wrinkles. The former gang leader now ran the diner's youth mentorship program, helping children who had lost parents in military service. Thanks, son, Frank replied, smiling at how natural that word now felt. The young man had become like family to him, spending hours listening to war stories and learning about the true meaning of service. The Wall of Heroes had been rebuilt, bigger and more meaningful than before. James Peterson's photograph now hung in the center, surrounded by hundreds of other veterans' photos. But there was something new beside each picture, stories written by family members, telling not just how these heroes died, but how they lived. Maria Gonzalez walked in, her Guardian Angels vest now featuring a Peterson's Place patch. Big day today, Frank, she said, settling onto a counter stool. The governor's coming for the official dedication. Frank nodded. The diner's transformation had caught national attention. What started as a local conflict had become a model for veteran-civilian cooperation across the country. Other towns had started similar programs, turning places of division into centers of healing. The morning sun streamed through new stained-glass windows, each one dedicated to a different branch of service. The light fell on tables where young veterans helped older ones navigate VA benefits, where military spouses found support groups, and where children of fallen soldiers found surrogate families. Remember when we thought we have to fight them? Mike Reynolds chuckled, joining Frank at the counter. The old intelligence officer now served as an advisor for the diner's veteran support programs. Sometimes the best victories come without a single punch thrown, Frank replied, watching William teach a young boy, the son of a fallen Marine, how to properly fold an American flag. The door chimed as Mrs. Thompson entered, exactly at 7 a.m. as she had for 30 years. But now she came with a purpose beyond breakfast. She ran the diner's letter writing program, helping young people connect with deployed service members. "Your brother would be proud, Frank," she said, patting his hand as she passed. "You built something special here." Frank touched the medal hanging on the wall beside him, his brother's silver star, now displayed alongside James's restored photograph. "We all built it," he corrected her. "Every person who chose understanding over anger, peace over conflict." Outside, motorcycles rumbled into the parking lot, not as a threat, but as a promise. Every weekend, veteran rider groups escorted families of fallen soldiers to the diner, creating a rolling honor guard that stretched for miles. Jenny approached Frank with a fresh cup of coffee and the morning paper. The headline read, "Peterson's Place: How One Veteran's Stand Created a National Movement." Below was a photo of Frank and William working together at the counter. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Jenny asked, gesturing to the busy diner full of unlikely friendships and healing hearts. Frank smiled, remembering that tense night a year ago. "In war, I learned that every enemy is just a friend you haven't understood yet," he said. "Sometimes it takes a lifetime to figure out how to win the right way." As the morning sun rose higher, Frank Peterson, the 94-year-old veteran who had faced down hatred with hope, watched his legacy unfold. In the end, his greatest victory hadn't come from his wartime heroics or his strategic mind, but from his unwavering belief that even the deepest wounds could heal with understanding and time. Peterson's Place had become more than a diner. It was a testament to the power of choosing peace over conflict, understanding over fear, and love over hate. And in that transformation, Frank had finally fulfilled his promise to his brother James, to make sure his sacrifice meant something lasting and good in the world. The old warrior had won his final battle by making peace, and his victory would inspire generations to come.